We often forget the most important thing about our countryside. It is a food factory. The land is there to give us the nutrients for our existence. The most important revolution in the Bronze Age was the alloying of copper and tin into a malleable metal called bronze. But the impact of this on the landscape was nothing when compared to the enormous influence of the people who came before, Neolithic man. Their influence on our land was to be the most enormous in the history of mankind and changed our relationship with the natural world forever. For it was the Neolithic people who were the first to abandon their ancient hunter-gatherer lifestyle and choose to settle in one location. We invented farming, the biological manipulation of plants and animals to control their production and reproduction and to provide a predictable food supply. It was the moment we stood apart from nature and the first step on our road to supposed superiority. It may seem like an obvious idea to us, but at the time it wasn't so easy. Life expectancy was around 30 years, arthritis, malnutrition and starvation were a constant threat, and the process of farming required an intense amount of labour. For example, just to make bread. The first stage would have involved deforesting an area, then tilling the soil, gathering and growing the seeds, then processing to make it edible. An intense effort, and that's just crops. The animals would also have needed domesticating. The land would need fencing, and all of this would need protecting against wild and dangerous animals. 5,000 years ago, we became the first animals to change the landscape to suit us. So why did we do it if it was so much trouble? The farming revolution can be traced back to the Near East some 9,000 years ago, when in a fertile valley man first decided to stop roaming and adapt the environment. It took a further 2,000 years for this idea to spread to Britain. We are unclear as to how. There is some suggestion it could have been migration from Europe, or more likely it was simply the adoption of a good idea by the natives. But Britain did not just suddenly switch to farming. In places where game and stock were plentiful, people still continued seasonal tracking. But eventually, all the people were won over, and Britain was settled. With the setting up of distinctive farms and settlements, the Neolithic people began the destruction of our wildwood. Vast swathes of tree cover were felled quickly, using newly designed stone axes, some imported from as far away as the Lake District. Methods such as ring barking and sometimes burning, though being so damp live wood is very hard to burn, were even developed, which shows the vigour in which open land and kindling was needed. The first Neolithic agriculturalists were just setting out on a long journey, and so originally not advanced enough to understand the cycles of crop rotation. This led to small-scale collapse of many settlements when after 10 to 20 years the soil could no longer support growth. The settlements themselves were mainly in lower areas, and each would have consisted of rectangular houses of turf and timber with thatched roofs. These combined dwelling houses with animals living alongside, similar to many medieval agrarian settlements. Each farm had small fields cut into the wildwood, and the waste ground around was used for pigs. Only one Neolithic settlement has been fully excavated in the Peak District, and to find it, we need to travel to the boundary between the limestone and gritstone on the outskirts of Buxton. This is Lismore Fields. In the 1980s, a new housing development was planned for this area. An archaeologist conducted a survey, but what they found was beyond their wildest dreams, for here was preserved one of the best Neolithic settlements in the whole of Britain. Features from 5,500 years ago were still clearly visible. A series of post holes were left within the ground, marking the site where a series of rectangular buildings for Neolithic man would have been sited. As well as that, there was pottery found which would have been used for cooking. They also found stone axes which would have been used for hammering down the trees for clearance. And even the flints and church that would have been used like Swiss army knives for cutting the meat off the animals that they had caught. It provided a remarkable insight into Neolithic life. The careful excavation even uncovered charred wheat, hazelnuts and crabapple seeds, an insight into the first crops and native food eaten during the 4th millennium BC. Carbon dating of organic material revealed the site was occupied around 3,500 BC during the early Neolithic, with a possibility of it being a temporary settlement even before that. Practically all of Lismore Fields has now been totally built upon, and you can tell by the noises around that this is part of the suburbs of Buxton. But there's still a little bit of wildness in the area, as part of the site, which leads down to the infant River Wye, still survives as a little patch of broadleaf woodland. Now, when you visit today, you may think this site is somewhat arbitrary, but in fact it was specifically chosen for its geographical location. Linking down to the River Wye, there would have been excellent fishing. The wildwood that would have been there at the time would have been filled with animals to hunt and berries and fruit for them to eat, and also being so close to the highlands where the tree cover was thinner, it would have been perfect for grazing their cattle and wild stock. Archaeologically, this is a fascinating site, but as nothing survives above ground, and due to its location, you don't really get the feel for Neolithic man like we did for Bronze Age man on Barboot Moor. But in the Peak District, we can find something above ground that really allows us a physical connection. On the summits and plateaus of a series of high peaks, huge mounds of earth and stone can be found. These are the burial places of Neolithic man. Varying in size and style as much as stone circles, chambered tombs and long barrows were the grand religious monuments for this era of humanity. Dating back to around 4000 BC, architecturally their design is fascinating. This is Wayland's Smithy, located beside the prehistoric Ridgeway in Oxfordshire. 56 metres long and 13 metres wide, it is host to a series of internal stone chambers which house the bones of the Neolithic dead. But this dramatic tomb is not the most fascinating aspect of the site, for when excavated in the 1960s, the remains of a much earlier and smaller mound with wooden chambers was discovered. This was clear evidence to show the evolution of these monuments. Radiocarbon dating has also suggested the change in styles may have taken place in as little as 50 years. In Neolithic terms, that is only a couple of generations. As we shall see, the Neolithic was an epoch that showed innovations almost as rapid as our own. Only a short distance from Oxfordshire, in the neighbouring county of Wiltshire, is the West Kennet Long Barrow, one of the longest in Britain at just shy of 100 metres in length. It is estimated that 15,700 man-hours were expended in its construction. Although externally its forecourt of stones and shape looks somewhat similar to Wayland's Smithy, inside the chambers have a very different layout. Neolithic burial mounds have highly variable internal structures. This is probably because neighbouring groups could see them from the outside, but only important individuals from each tribe would be allowed to enter them, meaning copying a specific layout was very difficult. Archaeologists have suggested that some of the entrances, with a large forecourt of stones leading into the passage, may have been representations of goddess worship. The shape and chambers in tombs like Wayland's Smithy mimicking the female form and representing a bridging point between birth, life and what lies beyond. However, in the West Kennet Long Barrow, the chambers appear to take the shape of an isosceles triangle. Whatever the intent behind chamber layout, crawling into the dark passage that entered the tomb must have been an extraordinary experience to our ancestors. Anthropologists suggest that the sensory deprivation experienced in a tomb may well have been used to induce visions. From excavation at numerous tombs, it appears that the bones were arranged carefully within each chamber. The lack of specific bones at certain sites suggests that these monuments were used for storing burials rather than as a permanent resting place. After death, the bodies would have been placed outside the settlement on a wooden platform open to the sky, where over a period of weeks the birds would have picked the bones clean. The bones were then taken and placed with care in the chambers. Later on, perhaps during festivals or rituals, specific bones were removed. As well as being of religious importance, the mound was also served as a focal point for the community. Standing in defining positions high in the landscape, away from the settlement, they were a part of life, but also separated from it. And standing on a ridge or summit, they would have been a message to all of a traditional ownership of the land. If anyone else arrived to claim it for settlement, the local tribe could point and say, "This is our land, for here our ancestors lie." There is a lot of variation across the country in these Neolithic mounds, but the two most important types are known as long barrows and chambered cairns, both of which are found in the Peak District. Long barrows were oblong burial mounds, higher and wider at one end and containing a chamber or chambers. Many were open, though some were also closed, which brings up interesting questions about the type and length of religious activities at the sites. Chambered cairns, unlike the well-built mound of a long barrow, were simply piles of rock laid on top of a chamber, passage or grave. None of these are definable to a particular culture or area, with a wide variety across Britain. Unfortunately, unlike the southern examples you've just seen, many of the Neolithic monuments in the Peak District are in a ruinous state. This is Five Wells, the highest chambered tomb in Derbyshire, standing over 400 metres above sea level. This spectacular location looks out towards the high moors of northern Derbyshire and across the Wye Valley and the Chee Gorge. It's a truly spectacular location for anyone to visit, and it's easy to see why the Neolithic peoples would have wanted to build their tomb in this location. It would have stood as a symbol to all those travelling in the area that this was their land, owned by their ancestors. Now, you may expect in this isolated spot the tomb would have survived relatively complete, but in fact what we find is the remains of a badly denuded chambered tomb. Two chambers survive, east and west. The western one has almost completely collapsed, but here in the east we have two 1.5 metre high portal stones defining the entrance to a tomb 2 metres long. You could have imagined the covering mound above reaching some height above and standing out as a symbol to all those around. Upon entering the chamber, you would have had to crouch and crawl to access the bones of the ancestors, and originally here there would have been a covering slab over the top, reducing the height considerably. It's been excavated numerous times. Thomas Bateman conducted one of his very quick surveys on August the 25th, 1846, finding several skeletons. In more recent excavations, when they dug up the backfill that's in the bottom of the tomb, they found the remains of 14 individuals of different ages and of different sexes. It is a truly spectacular location to visit to try and get to terms with what our Neolithic ancestors were like. Visible from most of the limestone plateau, Minninglow stands out wherever you are. A circular copse on a high hill with a large mound and wind-battered trees rising above it. The chambered cairn here has a complex history, originating as a small tomb before later being incorporated into a long cairn 35 by 15 metres, with at least 4 separate chambers. Then finally enlarged into a massive chambered circular cairn 45 by 28 metres in diameter and 2 metres high, with at least one further tomb being added. Unfortunately, there are downsides to being so prominent in the landscape. By the time this site was first historically recorded in the 18th century, all of its chambers had already been looted. But not just by contemporary individuals. During a recent investigation of the site, several Roman coins were discovered, meaning that the internal artefacts may well have disappeared some 2,000 years ago.
From Minninglow, we head north to just a few yards from the Great Stone Circle at Arborough.
Gib Hill was originally a long barrow, orientated east-northeast by west-southwest. During the Bronze Age, a barrow was superimposed on its top. The process of later communities adding on to the burial monuments of previous eras is an unusual practice, and may be the later culture trying to impose their cultural authority over the ancestors that had gone before. When Thomas Bateman excavated Gib Hill, he chose to dig in from ground level. Partway in, he was shocked but not hurt when the top of the mound collapsed into his tunnel. But this did reveal a small rectangular burial chamber known as a kist in the Bronze Age section of the mound above. Inside the kist was a ritual food vessel and human cremation. Bateman then carried on to the heart of the Neolithic long barrow, but found only disturbed bone and flints. He replaced the Bronze Age kist in the upper part of the mound, and its capstone is still visible on the top today. From the summit of Gib Hill, we can see the greatest Neolithic ritual monument of all on the horizon. We last visited Arborough to see the Great Stone Circle, but before this there was a much earlier monument on the site. The bank and ditch which surrounds the stone circle, known as a henge, dates from the Neolithic. Unlike the later stone circles, of which over 1,205 across the British Isles, far fewer henges were constructed, and the fact that most later had stone circles added to them rather than falling into disuse shows their importance to the native people. The circular enclosure may at first appear to be defensive, but is far from it. Defensive sites have an external ditch. A henges is internal, which would be of no strategic value. Instead, the bank, which originally stood 3 metres high, was designed to hide the internal sacred space from the outside world. The rituals that occurred within a henge are again a mystery. Excavations at other henges have revealed that some had timber circles added before stone ones, but no evidence of this has been found at Arborough. It is likely that this enclosure was not just for religious purposes, but would have given a focal point to the widely scattered population of Neolithic Britain. Important seasonal meetings probably took place, and outside there would have been markets for people to stock up on essentials for the following months or trade for luxury goods. A sister henge to Arborough, known as the Bull Ring, can be found below the dominating black edge in the village of Doveholes. Architecturally, the henge is very similar to Arborough, and this suggests they may have been built at the same time by the same people. The River Wye separates the Bull Ring from Arborough, and this may be the reason for both of the henges' positions, splitting the isolated populations of the Peak District into two distinct geographical areas. Just like Arborough, the Bull Ring did have standing stones added to it at a later date, but none now survive, the last being removed around 1787. It's not just the stones that have gone though. Over the past few decades, the henge was treated with great disrespect, with a quarry destroying part of the site, annual bonfires being lit in the centre, and a stage was even constructed over part of the henge bank. Luckily, its importance has now been recognised, and it is being cared for and protected for the enjoyment of all.
In the Peak District, two other nationally unique Neolithic monuments survive, which are extremely difficult to categorise. They lie on a bleak moorland plateau above the Chatsworth estate. One is Hobhurst House. Listed in 1882, it was the Peak District's first scheduled ancient monument and is named after a sprite that lives in the surrounding forests and is said to stalk over the moors by night. Far away from the nearest road, its features have survived surprisingly well. A low bank and large ditch surround a central mound with a rectangular setting of stones on its top. Bateman excavated the small stone setting in the 19th century and found a cremation burial and two pieces of galena surrounded by a small arc of stones. A short distance away, in the midst of deep heather, is the monument of Harland Edge. On first inspection, it appears to be an oval cairn with an external curb, but a closer look reveals two entrances to the northeast and southwest, defined by tall portal stones. The entrances lead to a uniquely boat-shaped flat central area. Both of these sites defy categorisation, having a whole selection of features from many later monuments. Hobhurst House, outer bank and ditch are characteristic of a henge, and the internal stone setting is very similar to a later ring cairn or embanked stone circle. Harland Edge has a curb of stones reminiscent of a ring cairn, but the portaled entrances and passage have similarities with a chambered tomb, and the central boat shape is plain perplexing. Both of these sites should perhaps be thought of as Neolithic prototypes. Here we have evidence of a change in monuments from closed tombs to open circles. Could these strange structures show more than just a change in architectural design, but a change in religion too?
There is much postulation that Neolithic people believed in a mother goddess of the earth, from the shape and affinities of chambered tombs to amazing carvings and stone models of a shared earth mother that had been found on the continent. But during the Bronze Age, instead of worshipping the earth, many monuments seem to point to the skies, whether in their solar shape or alignment to the major cycles of the sun and moon. We also have the change in burial practices. From the end of the Neolithic, great communal mounds were no longer constructed, replaced by small barrows and cairns for the individual. One possible reason for this can be found not in this country, but the geological record of Iceland. Around 3000 BC, there was a climatic deterioration, linked with an increased period of volcanic activity, just like the eruption of Mount Hekla, which was the final straw leading to the abandonment of settlements in the Late Bronze Age. Could these angry skies have been a trigger for changing belief systems? To understand the change in monument building between the Late Neolithic and the Early Bronze Age, we need to return to Arbor. Although what's most dramatic here is the stone circle, there is something that dates back to an even ancient time, and it is much more fascinating to archaeologists. It is this structure, a cove. Only a few of them remain in the British Isles now, and they appear to be a bridging monument between the religion of the Neolithic and the religion of the Bronze Age. We know that at the end of the Neolithic there was a disastrous volcanic eruption in Iceland that triggered failed harvests, triggered disease and famine across Neolithic Britain. During the Neolithic they had built their enclosed long barrows, they would have used them as mausoleum, they would have gone in and removed them for ritual purposes. And during the Bronze Age we know they built these great stone circles, open to the sky. Perhaps they had turned their backs on their ancestors and turned to those angry skies that had brought down so much destruction on them. What's interesting about the cove is that this is a rectangular enclosure surrounded by stone, very similar to the chambers that you would have found inside the long barrows. Perhaps it was that this was a linking monument. Instead of a closed tomb, this was open to the sky. The great stones that would have stood over 8 foot high would have been a monument to those angry skies, but also a link back to their ancestors. It's fascinating to conjecture on the use of this prehistoric monument, most likely for a ritual purpose. But maybe it's something that we will never be able to answer, lost in the mists of time. One thing we must always be is very careful about overlaying our own religious preconceptions onto any ancient monument. The Neolithic builders probably saw the spiritual and practical as one and the same. Special places may have been where activities outside the normal routine of the day took place, but they also helped them to make sense of the world. All people experience physical transformations as they mature, and so too does the natural world as it evolves in endless cycles. It is highly likely, therefore, that before these monuments were built, it was the natural features such as great peaks, rocks and springs that held special reverence for prehistoric man. And many of these prehistoric ritual monuments point towards that. All are in dramatic locations that frame aspects of the landscape and offer spectacular vistas. The power of landscape is intoxicating to those who feel at one with the raw power of the earth. This was also the first time in our history that we stood proud but alone from the rest of the animal kingdom. We now had the ability to change and manipulate life and landscape for our own reasons. The monuments are not natural, they stand apart, a sacred human construction.